Are we not blessed? Wow. And it is so good to look out and see the family together. Turn around and look. Just look. Look at people maybe you haven't seen for a little while, and just how good it is to see them and to be in community together. I think it is absolutely true that life is better in community. Life is better in spiritual community. So what do you do with Jesus in a New Thought church? In a church that looks at Jesus differently than mainline Christianity, and certainly very differently than fundamentalist Christianity looks at Jesus. What do we do with him? I think it was you, Jimmer, who first told me of the quote, and I don't remember who to attribute the quote to, but the quote that says, I really love the guy. I love Jesus, but I'm not so fond of some in his fan club. Can you relate to that? I do love him, and I do consider him my teacher and my spiritual way shower. I look at him as a teacher of consciousness, as someone that stood for a different way of living and being. Certainly someone who stood in his day and age for a different form of social justice, repeatedly contrasting what he thought was the way to live life and the way to interact with one another from the way the old Mosaic law would teach social justice. He stood as someone who believed in the goodness within individuals. He stood as someone who understood his relationship with God, his relationship with the Father, and encouraged others to find that same kind of relationship. We say in Unity that Jesus was not the great exception, but what? The great example. The great example. But Easter, what do you do with it? So there was a family who was vacationing in Jerusalem, and the family was an extended family. It was the mother and the father and some kids and the mother-in-law, and they were having a wonderful time visiting all the sites of the Holy City, spending time in Jerusalem, but tragedy struck. The mother-in-law died while in Jerusalem, and so they needed to make preparations to have her body sent back home. And so the husband went to the American consulate to begin that process. And they said to him, well, yes, we can mail her body, not mail her body, but send her body. Too much UPS in my life. Can send her body back home, but it's actually a very complicated and very, very expensive process. To do that, it can cost upwards of $10,000. So what most people do if something like this happens in Jerusalem is they will bury the body here, and it's much less expensive. It only costs a few $100s to do that. And so the man thought for a moment, and then he said, no, I absolutely positively want to send her body back to the U.S. And the consulate said, well, wow, you must have really, really loved your mother-in-law. He said, well, no, it's not so much that, but I heard of a guy who was buried here a very long time ago, and 3 days later he rose from the dead, and I'm not taking any chances. I'm not taking any chances. Poor mother-in-laws, and if you are a mother-in-law, please forgive the joke. It just wouldn't work with father-in-law, would it? It just wouldn't have the same punch. So regardless, why do I tell that joke, besides the fact that it's incredibly funny? Because regardless of how you look upon the resurrection, whether you look upon the resurrection as something that literally happened, or whether you look upon the resurrection as something mystical and metaphysical, what we cannot deny is something happened. Something happened in the mind and the heart, the consciousness, the soul of this man called Jesus so radically that we still talk about him today, that there's even a story about him, that we even meet to try to understand something about him. So something absolutely happened. And I believe that we can learn from his teachings and his message how to live our lives much better. That, to me, is the good news. The good news is that he gives us a blueprint for that. And I want to share some of that blueprint this morning with the idea that these teachings help us to be able to face and meet the changes in our lives. There's no question that you and I are living in a day and age where change is happening faster and faster than ever before. My friend, sociologist and anthropologist Jean Houston often speaks of jump time. And jump time is a time in human history when humanity jumps forward in a phenomenal way, leaving old systems and old structures and old ways of being behind and stepping into something that we might today call a complete paradigm shift, affecting the arts and medicine and health and music and science and religion and governance and politics. And the last such time as that would have been the Renaissance, a 300-year period in which life before the Renaissance and life after the Renaissance was radically different. Radically different. The structures were all different. Well, you and I are living in a time such as that now, but it's not going to take 300 years for us to be in a completely radically different world. And those of us sitting in this room, I believe, absolutely feel that we can together, through spiritual practice and principle, bring forth a new humanity, starting with ourselves. That we can evolve our consciousness in such a way and to such a degree that we do not leave anybody behind, that we bring forward a world that works for everyone, leaving no one and nothing behind. Am I right? Do you not believe that this is possible? So how do we do that? It's a big idea, but how do we do that? Like any big idea, we start right where we are. And you and I sit in a teaching that is absolutely practical. It is a teaching taken from the ideas and the concepts of Jesus the Christ. And so I want to share some of those with you right now, some of the ideas of how we meet and embrace change so that we can move through it, a grown individual, a spiritually advanced individual, so we can be about helping to create a world that works for everyone. The first is this idea of facing and embracing change. Facing and embracing change. Say that with me. Facing and embracing change. Jesus knew when he went into Jerusalem what was going to happen. He knew. And yet he did not, like Jonah in the story, where God told Jonah to go to Nineveh to teach the people there. Jonah jumped ship and said, no, well, he didn't jump ship. He got ship and he turned around the other direction. Jesus didn't do that. He knew what was about to happen. He knew the political climate around him. And yet he also knew he was called to something more. He faced and embraced his own destiny and his own future. He was able to stand solid knowing who and what he was and who and what God was, ultimately knowing. Can we do the same? Can we stand in the changes that are happening to us individually? Maybe you've recently lost your job. Maybe you've lost a loved one. Maybe you're dealing with a big health issue or a financial issue. Can you face and embrace the change that is happening in your life? I believe that you can. I know that you will need to. And I relate to Emma Curtis Hopkins and her affirmation about how to look upon change, how to look upon our lives when it seems challenging and difficult, when it seems like we're going to meet a real significant obstacle or difficulty. She says that we are to look at it with this attitude. This too is good. This too is God. This too is for me, and I demand a blessing in it. This too is good. This too is God. Too is for me. And I demand to see a blessing in it. This too is good. This too is God. This too is for me. And I demand to see a blessing in it. Say that with me. This too is good. This too is God. This too is for me. And I demand to see a blessing in it. When we can approach everything, and I mean without exception, everything and everyone in our lives, with that lens, we will be able to embrace and face change. And the purpose of embracing and facing change is because that's what grows us. That's what evolves us. That's what pulls us forward. Now, what we also need to realize is that we may be fully willing to embrace and face change, but it may scare the dickens out of us. We may feel ill-equipped to meet it. And here's where we need to practice partnering and praying. Partnering and praying. Say that with me, please. Partnering and praying. After Jesus celebrated the Last Supper, or Passover, we call it the Last Supper. He was celebrating Passover meal with his disciples. He was troubled, we're told. I'm so glad that we were told he was troubled, because there are plenty of times in my life, even with strong, solid spiritual practice spanning several decades now, there are times that I will feel overwhelmed, or times I will feel troubled, I will feel afraid. And so I'm so glad to know that he felt that way as well, and that the gospel writers included that, because they didn't get all of it very right, in my opinion. But anyway, he was troubled. And so he went to pray. He went to the Garden of Gethsemane. He went to pray. What would our lives be like if we were absolutely committed to our prayer life when things are difficult, when we've got a big change or a problem, or we have an opportunity and we don't know whether to say yes to it or not? If we were to make a deep commitment to pray, it always both humors me and angers me how often I will hear people say, well, when all else fails, pray about it. I mean, think about that for a moment. Maybe that's in part why it's failing to begin with. When all else fails, pray about it. Why not pray first? Why not pray first, right? So he went to the garden to pray. Praying and partnering. He didn't go alone. He took a few of his disciples with him. Now, he had a problem. I talked about this last week. What was his problem? He took his disciples with him, and he said, stay, sit, watch, and pray with me. And what did they do? They fell asleep. Did they fall asleep more than once? Yes, they fell asleep more than once. That is not a good thing when you are partnering with someone for your growth and development. You want people who can stay awake. That does not mean you ignore people in your life that you would say are spiritually asleep. It does not mean that you ignore them or that you judge them, but they are not the first responders in your life of challenge. The first responders you want to call forth, that you want to partner with, are those who are awake. What does that mean? I'm obviously not meaning just physically awake. I am meaning those who know who they are spiritually, who know that they are a child of God, by whatever name you want to call God, and that so is everybody else, regardless of their religion or lack of, regardless of their race, regardless of their sexual orientation, regardless of their past. They are people who are awake to the truth of who they are and who everybody else is. And they are people who are awake to spiritual principle, spiritual law, and how it works in life. And the reason that we want to partner with awake people is that they can help us when we are challenged and we start to fall asleep. Have you noticed how sometimes the first response you have to change is to fall asleep? To go back to old negative ways of thinking? We need to pray through that. We need to partner through that with those who are awake to stand solidly in the face of change. And the third is trusting and surrendering. Trusting and surrendering. Say that with me. Trusting and surrendering. Boy, was that the epitome of what Jesus experienced in the garden. He had a moment, a very specific moment in that garden that we can relate to, where he said, "Not my will, but thy will be done." A specific moment in the garden where he asked, if there's any way, let this cup pass from me. Have you ever felt that way about something in your life? It's big that you're dealing with. Hey, God, we start bargaining with God in those moments, don't we? Hey, God, if you'll just make this go away, or if you'll just fix this for me, I'll be a much better prayer, I promise. Or I'll do my forgiveness work, or my gratitude work, or I'll start serving, or I'll start giving, or whatever that may be. We bargain. And in a way, Jesus was doing a little bit of that in the garden, wasn't he? That makes me love him. That makes me love him. There's any way that this can be taken from me, let it be taken from me. And where I feel inspired to grow is when he said, "But not my will be done, thy will be done." That's the trusting and the surrendering. The trusting and the surrendering. He had to trust that there was a presence and a power greater than him. He had to trust that there is that in him that is eternal. He had to trust and surrender to a higher purpose and a higher plan. Oftentimes in our limited vision, we misread what's going on in our lives. Oftentimes in our limited vision, we are tempted to judge according to appearances, and appearances can be very frightening and very scary sometimes, whether we're looking at our individual lives, where things might be falling apart or difficult, or we're looking at the world and we read of terrorist attacks in Brussels and we feel, what's that all about? And yet, to stand solid in the absolute knowingness that beneath the appearances, there is a divine plan. There is no place where God is not. And that we must lift our vision, which to me is what Easter is about. Lifting our vision up so we can see through and beyond. As I bring this to closure, I want to close with a story written by Alan Cohen. I love his writing. He writes very, very simply and yet very deeply in a very practical sort of way. I love his book, The Dragon Doesn't Live Here Anymore. I think it's one of the first ones he wrote. And though this particular incident has nothing to do with Easter, in many ways it has an awful lot to do with Easter and being able to trust in God and to surrender, knowing that there is a plan and there is a purpose. So he writes, "While I was walking through a terminal in the Los Angeles airport, I felt annoyed and inconvenienced by the massive construction projects going on around me. Squeezed between temporary plywood walls, I navigated a row of tall scaffolds and took a lengthy detour to baggage claim. I grumbled to myself about what a mess the place was and how long it was taking to remodel it. Then I saw a poster that stopped me in my tracks. It was an artist's rendering of what the airport would look like when the construction was complete. It was magnificent. The glass atrium roofs, sleek marble corridors, and potted palms were a delight to behold, a far cry from the current chaos. Then I relaxed. If that is what this is leading to, I thought, I'm glad they're doing it. As I dropped my resistance, I enjoyed the process, including the construction phase. When I returned to the airport a year later, the vision had become a magnificent reality. The artist's rendering had come to life. Construction is usually messy. You may have to turn ground over, tear an existing structure down, or pile materials all over the place. Likewise, sometimes your life feels stable, and other times it's subject to demolition, construction, and creative chaos, or all three. Since we are always in a state of beginning an element of the human journey, do not resist or begrudge the messy construction stage. It is part of the deal. If you feel overwhelmed during the transition phase, shift your attention to the artist's rendering. Behold a grand and glorious vision of where you are headed, far more beautiful and functional than the format being undone. Sometimes you cannot see the artist's rendering, and you have no idea where your life is moving. Just trust that there is a blueprint for a brilliant new creation. One day you will walk through the corridor of your new structure and marvel at its splendor. It's a little bit like the tomb, walking through the corridor, walking from one way of living and being, from one aspect of your life, walking through the corridor to something new and something beautiful. Facing and embracing, not turning away from the change, partnering with those who are awake and praying, and trusting in God and surrendering your will to the higher will and the blueprint that's meant for your life. Namaste and happy Easter.